What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and this one is going to be related to the PTS. Now normally I have a policy of not really doing any sort of theory crafting video until the game is released on live. So I basically, my opinion has always been to basically not release any sort of build videos, any sort of theory crafting videos or anything like that until everything is finalized. In other words, once it is released on the live server. However, I did think that this particular topic is something that is worthy of bringing up before it hits live, because there have been several opportunities now for ZOS to kind of rebalance these things out, and while there are still 2 weeks of the PTS cycle left before it hits live, I do think it is a good opportunity to kind of look at these this topic right here. So we're going to be looking at jewelry traits, the new jewelry traits. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Infused, and how that compares to the base game jewelry traits on live right now, which are Arcane and Robust. So for those of you guys who haven't been really paying attention to what's been happening on the PTS, Infused is a new jewelry trait that basically does the exact same thing as Infused does on the armor and on weapon pieces. It basically enhances the enchantment on your jewelry piece. In this case, when you have it completely golded out, Infused increases the potency of your enchant by 60%. Now, the natural question now becomes is it better, more beneficial to run all of your jewelry enchants to be arcane, or robust? Is it better to have them all run Infused, or do you want some sort of combination of the two? And that's kind of I want to say a little bit of a complicated answer, and that's because Arcane and Robust, the jewelry traits, do count towards your base game stats. In other words, if you take a look at the Eso Build Editor and go over to Stamina, since I'm on a Stamina Sork build right now, you'll see here that it falls under your item stamina. So basically, any sort of robust trait falls into item stamina. So right now we have 3657. And if I change one of these traits to robust, my stamina goes up because my item.stamina went up. Now if you take a look at where item.stamina is in the equation, it's starting right here. And this entire equation here, this is basically your what's called base stamina. And this is actually impacted by this right here, which is your, oh sorry, missed one there, but it's affected by this, which is basically the CP bonus, so you get an additional 20% here, and then this entire thing is affected by all of your stamina passives, so whether you have buffs or any sort of skills active. So buffs, for example, like Warhorn, skills, these comes from things like bound armaments, for example, on a Sork, or any sort of other racial passives, like if you're a red guard you get 10% additional stamina. So your item stamina, your robust trait, is actually impacted by all these passives, so your CPs, as well as any sort of passives that you might have. Now, you kind of have the same thing happening here with weapon damage now. So if you take a look at weapon damage here, you'll see here that you have item weapon damage, which comes also from your jewelry enchant. So whenever you have a weapon damage glyph, this trait will go up or down. So right now we have 3034, and if I change this robust to an infused, so now my weapon enchant basically went up in potency. You can see it increased 3138. Now item weapon damage sits right here, and this is considered part of your base weapon damage, and again this is affected by your buffs, any sort of skills you have, any sort of buffs you have. So you know, major, minor, brutality, any sort of passives you have, such as the flawless Dawnbreaker and the fighter skills passive, that all impacts your weapon damage that comes from your jewelry enchant. Now, Magicka and Stamina have different sources of both max Stam, max Magicka, as well as spell power and weapon power boosts. Generally speaking, it's easier to obtain better max Magicka than compared to max Stamina. So for example, for Magicka DPS, you kind of have a couple of sources of additional max Magicka. You have any sort of racial passives, obviously, so it's usually going to be a +10 if you're an Altmer, but if you're a Dark Elf, it's +9, pretty small difference there. You have your Undaunted Metal. Because Magicka DPS tend to go 5-1-1, you get 6% from that when it's fully maxed out. Magicka DPS typically run Inner Light, not always double barred, but it's usually on your front bar for that 5% additional max Magicka. And then you also have a passive from the Magi skill line, which gives you additional 2% when you have Inner Light slotted. And then if you also have Aggressive Warhorn, which gives you 10% additional magicka as well. Compare that to Stamina. Stamina doesn't really have that much. So basically you have a racial passive. You have 6% for example, if you're a Wood Elf, or 10% if you are a Redguard. And then you have Undaunted Metal. Now you could have anywhere between 2 to 4%. So basically a lot of stamina are running 6 medium, 1 heavy, but some stamina users are also running 7 medium, so it's going to depend on that. And that's basically it. You don't really get any additional max stamina aside from Aggressive Warhorn, which gives you additional 10%. So obviously you can tell here that stamina doesn't have quite as many percentage boosts to their max stamina pool compared to max magicka, mainly because max magicka DPS have access to the max magicka boost in the mage's skill tree. However, to kind of balance this out, so to speak, the places where you can get spell damage and weapon damage also differ. So for magicka DPS, you obviously have major and minor sorcery, and that's basically it. DKs, Nightblades, Templars, you don't really have any sort of additional modifiers there. Sorks, you do have Expert Mage passive, which boosts your spell damage by 2% for every Sork ability you have, so if you have like 3, it's going to be like 6%. Then Magicka Wardens also don't have any sort of additional spell damage multipliers. Advanced Species, which people commonly confuse as improving your spell damage, actually improves your damage done, which is a completely different part of the damage equation. So there's not that many sources of spell damage modifiers for magicka DPS. On the other hand, for stamina DPS, you have a lot more sources of weapon damage modifiers. So you have your major minor brutality, which gives you 25%. Then you have light medium armor passive, which gives you 12% additional weapon damage when you have 5 pieces of medium armor. So that's 12% extra right there. Then you have the Fighter's Guild passive Slayer, which will normally give you 6% while you're on your front bar, although this could vary depending on your specific class. It's usually going to be Rearming Trap on your front bar as well as Flawless Dawnbreaker. Then Flawless Dawnbreaker itself also gives you plus 5% weapon damage. So you can tell Stamina DPS have a lot more sources of weapon damage modifiers compared to Magicka DPS with their spell damage modifiers. Now obviously this is going to make a fairly big difference when you take a look at Infused versus Arcane or Robust, because everything there counts towards your base game stats. So that's all affected by those percentage modifiers. So what does that mean? It could mean, for example, that Arcane is going to be better for Magicka DPS because they have more sources of max magicka modifiers, and Infused might be better for stamina DPS because they have more sources of weapon damage modifiers. And so what I did was basically I used the Eso Build Editor. I basically used pretty much the standard meta, so it's usually going to be like VO, Mechanical Acuity. In most cases, the new sets are not on there, so normally I would use Reliquin instead of Vicious Ophidian, but since the new sets aren't on there, I either used VO or War Machine depending on the class. And in Veladreths, except for Stamsorks, for basically everybody is going to be using Veladreths. Then I basically used the standard bar setup here. So this is an example bar setup here for Stamsork, and I just compared the effective weapon power on the front bar here with certain buffs applied. So we assume that we're hitting the penetration cap. So we have Alkosh, we have Crusher, we have Major and Minor Fracture, and this is the exact same thing for Magicka except with Breach. And then we assume that you have Major Brutality, you have Major Savagery, Sorcery and Prophecy for Magicka users. We assume you have Minor Berserk. This comes from Combat Prayer, so this should have pretty good uptime. Minor Brutality, as well as Minor Savagery for Magicka, Minor Sorcery, Minor Prophecy. We assumed you have Minor Force up for Stamina DPS. This is going to be coming from Rearming Trap. For Magicka DPS, we're assuming this is coming from either Rearming Trap, Stalwart Guard, or the new Psijic Order skill that gives you Minor Force. We also assume that you had Minor Vulnerability up, so this comes from Shock Damage enchants, so you'll typically have fairly good uptime on Minor Vulnerability, so this is why we assumed it's up. Then Spell Power Cure, Warhorn, and Weapon Damage enchant, we also assume that these buffs are also up. And then after we've basically turned on all these buffs, we took a look at either the effective weapon or effective spell power, and we basically took it with no Infused and no Robust, so basically I just used, in this case, Bloodthirsty as a baseline. Then we went with all Robust or Arcane, Then we slowly swap them out. So we would go something like this. We'd start with 3 robust. Then we'd swap one of these out for infused. And all these enchants are always going to be either weapon or spell damage. And then we made a note of the weapon damage or spell damage, and we kept on going until we had all 3 of them be infused, and then we took a look at the percentage difference between them. And so this is the ultimate spreadsheet that we came up with. So you can see here buffs that were considered: Alkosh, Taurogs, Major Minor Breach, Major Minor Sorcery / Brutality, Major Minor Prophecy, Savagery, Minor Berserk, Minor Force, Minor Vulnerability, SPC, Warhorn, and Weapon Damage Enchant. We optimized our race, so we assumed we were doing Dunmer for Magicka users and Redguard for Stamina users. Specific builds are in the comments here, so I just made a comment here for my own personal kind of sanity. We'd use the Apprentice for Magicka as our Mundus Stone, and we'd then use the Lover for Stamina as our Mundus Stone, and this is because of the changes that are coming up in Summerset. You're either going to be using Twice Fang Snake or the Lover to make up for the loss of penetration from the changes in Night Mother's Gaze and Sunderflame. So a lot of stamina DPS that I've talked to have had pretty good results using either of them, but we're going with the Lover just because I like to have VO or War Machine on. And you kind of need to run the Lover if you're going to be doing something like War Machine Acuity anyways. And then we looked at the front bar effective spell or weapon power. And then for food, it was either, for Magicka DPS, it was always going to be Clockwork Citrus Fillet. And for stamina users, again, this is going to vary depending on the specific build. It's either going to be Dubious, Camoran Throne, or Blue Food. Most stamina DPS were using Blue Food. I actually have to change some of these because I did alter it a little bit based on what's going to happen in the Summerset patch. So actually, Stam DK were the only ones that I used Blue Food for because they're the only ones who are probably going to remain with the heavy attack rotation. Everybody else was basically using Dubious because light attacks got a pretty nice buff in Summerset for everybody. And so this column here is our baseline effective spell or weapon damage. So this is without any Arcane, no Robust, no Infused. And this column here is all 3 jewelry pieces were either Arcane or Robust. Then we have 1 Infused, 2 Arcane Robust, 1 Arcane Robust, 2 Infused, and then all Infused, and then we had our percentage difference here. So we can see here that pretty much across the board for Magicka users, except with the exception of a Pet Sork, Arcane won out against Infused. So again, these are just kind of effective spell damage. This is not an indication of the amount of DPS each class can pull. This is just here as sort of a metric to measure, compare against. And so we can see Arcane does better, not by a huge margin, but by a small margin. The largest margin here is for Magicka Nightblades, mainly because of they have a passive under the Siphoning skill tree, which gives them 8% additional max Magicka. So that is the biggest difference there, and even then that's only about a third of a percentage point. Everything else here is pretty small, 0.03%, 0.03%, 0.03%, 0.05%, 0.06%. So it's a pretty small difference between Arcane and Infused. So for Magicka DPS, it does seem like, at the very least, if you're going to be looking at either Arcane or Infused, you can stick with your default Arcane jewelry. For Stamina DPS, though, it's the complete opposite. Infused actually wins out against Robust, and that's pretty much what we expected because of Stamina DPS have a lot more modifiers to their weapon damage. So it naturally makes sense that Infused would win out compared to Robust. And they're all pretty close together. Nightblades have about a 0.96% difference. Sorks were 0.8. Stam Decays about 0.8. Stamplars 0.98. Stamina Wardens were about 0.78%, so it's all around 1% or so difference just in terms of this metric. Again, this is not going to necessarily translate in actual in-game performance. This is just kind of a very, very optimized scenario here. So the general rule of thumb seems to be if you're going to be looking at either Arcane, Robust, or Infused for your DPS, if you're Magicka DPS, stick with Arcane. Robust is just a little bit worse. It's not that much worse. You're not really going to be noticing that big of a difference. But if you're going for Stamina DPS, go for Infused instead of Robust. It's going to be about a 1% difference just from a very, very optimized standpoint. So in an in-raid scenario, this disparity might grow, it might shrink, but I'm going to err on the side that in an actual raid scenario, this disparity is going to grow even more. Now, something to keep in mind here, this does not compare either of these traits with Bloodthirsty. Right now, Bloodthirsty is overperforming on the PTS dummy parses. In raid scenarios, I haven't done enough raids on the PTS to really make a comparison between Arcane, Infused, and Bloodthirsty. My personal thinking is that because you have so many DPS, if everybody runs Bloodthirsty in a raid, you have 8 DPS running Bloodthirsty. Yes, the boss is going to die very quick, but because you have a shortened time, your DPS is also going to end up being a little bit artificially at least lowered. So that's something that I want to keep in mind. It's also Bloodthirsty might be nerfed. We're not 100% sure yet. Again, there's still 2 weeks of balance patches coming in. Right, they haven't touched it in the past 2 patches, so maybe they won't touch it next patch, but we'll have to wait and see. So that's it for this video. There was another EU player who actually also did a very similar comparison, and I'll have a link to their website down in the description below for you guys if you want to see their math and their comparison. They pretty much came to pretty much the same conclusion that I did here, but it's always nice to have somebody double check your work for you. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.